Sorry.
Oh, I just have to press continue, I guess.
Yep, you're good.
Yeah.
Okay. The Visiting Artist Program, funded by PAFA's graduate program, brings an outstanding roster of local, national, and international artists to PAFA each semester for lectures, critiques, and workshops. The program exposes students and the public to a range of artistic approaches and fosters discussion about contemporary art and ideas. Before we begin, the Visiting Artist Program wants to thank the PNC Arts Alive program for sponsoring today's lecture. PNC Arts Alive challenges visual and performing arts organizations to put forth their best, most original thinking and expanding audience participation and engagement. This commitment advances the PNC Foundation's mission of community development. This afternoon, we are pleased to have Michelle Segre joining us. Michelle Segre is a multimedia textile sculptor born in Israel and currently lives and works in New York City. She holds an MFA from the Tyler School of Art in Rome and a BFA from the Cooper Union School of Art.
Actually, I don't have an MFA. Sorry.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Oh, that was on your website.
I went to Tyler. No, it's not MFA, BFA from Cooper, and went to Tyler for a semester in Rome.
Oh, okay. Correction. Correction.
No MFA.
Okay, thanks for the clarification. Her sculptures intertwine materials such as metal, yarn, paper, plaster, and ephemeral substances such as beeswax, moldy bread, and mushrooms into pieces that suggest the relationship between nature and the universe. Michelle's work has been included in various national and international solo and group exhibitions, her most recent being a solo show at the Lumber Room in Portland, Oregon. She has been awarded various prestigious grants and fellowships, including the Colene Brown Art Prize and the Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship. Her work has also been featured in a vast array of publications and public collections at the Colorado University Museum in Boulder, Colorado, the Katonah Museum of Art in New York, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Michelle. You may now begin sharing your screen.
Hi, everyone. Okay. I'm about to share here. And just going to switch to the full screen mode. Okay. So I'm starting this lecture off by showing you some of the earliest pieces that I ever made. Back in the early mid 90s is about when I started making sculpture. I had experimented with all kinds of different materials, like mainly natural things like soil and mold, and eventually settled on beeswax as my primary material. I started making these pieces that were based on objects in the real world, but were enlarged and magnified. So they were enlarged 17.5 times life size. And the details were the main focus of the work. So the details became like more important than the whole. And I was trying to kind of create a distortion of reality through this magnification, specifically magnifying detritus, things that were like, pieces of garbage, basically, like chicken bones and a wedge of cheese, things that were in a state of decay. And I was using decay as kind of a way to examine like a relationship between nature, the body, also the idea of decay leading to regeneration and rebirth. And so there were different fascinations of mine, like the idea of the absurd, the absurdity of magnifying and monumentalizing detritus and garbage, the grotesque and the uncanny, the mysteriousness of what these objects did to our subconscious mind. And things started to get more abstract and weird. You know, they became less and less realistic and more kind of fictionalized. So this is a group from around the first piece I showed you was from 1995, 96. And this work is jumping to 2006, sorry. And around this time, I also became more aware of this idea that when you look at a sculpture or an object, it's almost like it's looking back at you. And so I started to kind of be interested in this relationship between the viewer and the object and the kind of exchange that happened between the two. And what exactly was the nature of that exchange. So like this piece from 2007 is called Portal, and it kind of looks a little bit like an ear, so it's kind of related to the body in that way. And it appears to be emitting a kind of energy into the space around it. So I was interested in the nature of that energy, like how to create a piece that would kind of suck you into another world, give you a kind of heightened sense of perception, like looking at the world through a distortion lens of some kind. So this was also the last work with beeswax that I made. At this time, I was having kind of a crisis with the material. It was very labor intensive. It would take me like weeks and weeks, months to make works because the technique that I was using with the wax was very slow. And I started to feel a kind of oppression from the material, and was like like the tyranny of the material should never be something that prevents you from making work. So I began to experiment with not using the beeswax and just playing around with materials that have always existed in the pieces, which is paper mache and metal and other kinds of more kind of humble materials. So this one, this is the back of that piece, and just to have the details were extremely important and occupied most of the time in making the piece. And from this, I eventually got to this. So this is now jumping to 2010. And this was the first piece that I found to be kind of acceptable without using the beeswax. So I had, tried to get to a point where the materials would seem like would have a meaning for me. And it was very hard to do after being so dependent on enclosing everything in the wax, So it took a long time, but eventually one day I came into my studio and I looked at this work and I said, wow, that's a finished piece. This is it. Like it was kind of a eureka moment, because it ended up opening and expanding my whole vocabulary. And from that point on, I felt like anything could be a material for a sculpture, that the whole world had essentially opened up. And my way of working changed from being this very kind of linear A plus B equals C, where I would think of an idea and and then execute it, and I would know more or less what it would look like at the end. So now I went from that to having this very improvisational approach where I really didn't know where the end was ever going to be. And in fact, one of the things that was so liberating about this way of working was that I would make works by like bending pieces of metal and then adding things and subtracting things and using old discarded test pieces. Like this centerpiece has these like test pieces that had been sitting around my studio for years, and just like playing. It was more like child play, like a way of working where you don't know, where there is no like fixed end product. So the equations had opened up and was no longer like an A plus B plus C, but it could be like anything could be placed in those equations. And so that also created a situation where I wouldn't necessarily know when to stop working on a piece, so I'd have to kind of leave things till they weren't annoying me in some way, and then it would feel like it was done, But in truth, I've always felt like any of these pieces could actually be, I could go back into them and continue them or add them to other works or create an installation out of them. And so it kind of really opened up a lot of possibilities in that way. And I was still like interested in the same things, like the micro world versus the macro world, so these pieces are almost like diagrams of solar systems, at the same time that they could also be like magnifications of some molecule in in a petri dish. So I liked how scale wise the concept could expand and contract in that kind of way. And this particular piece has cat litter in it as one of the materials. That's what this orange to gray stuff is over here. And one of the things that was happening too was that I played more with gravity and balance, and I started to love the kind of things that would happen when things were like so like teetering, like on the verge of collapse. There was this kind of tension that would happen where with things just precariously balanced or barely held together. And I loved the kind of sense of danger that would happen when, like feel like the piece could just, the whole thing could maybe just fall over itself, And so that there was something exciting about that also, just as an idea, like how to never make something that is too comfortable with itself, but to always have this kind of edginess to the form, where it's like pushing on the boundaries of what's acceptable as art, like, is it really finished or not? It's like, it calls questions onto itself, which I found to be exciting. So this is an image of a group of works from 2012, I think. Yeah, 2012. And with this work, during this time period, I was doing a lot of songwriting. Like I started getting into writing these like weird folk songs and playing music with my friends, and a lot of the wordplay that came from the music and the kind of improvisational things that happened musically started to affect also the way that I was working and I began to come up with titles for my pieces. And the titles, the wordplay that happened with the titles was actually, I think, influencing the way the works were getting made as well. So it was like they were kind of playing off each other in that way. And I was also like going to see a lot of improvisational jazz. And it was all like kind of leaking into the way that I was approaching the work. So the title of this show was Lost Songs of the Filament, as though it was like an album, like a recorded album. This piece is called Let Me Love Your Brain. And the linear elements start to become increasingly more important in the work. I became very interested in the way that line can activate space through minimal means. So even when you stretch a piece of string from floor to ceiling, right, you're immediately creating this relationship between the floor and the ceiling. And you're not just aware of that string, but you're also aware of all the space around that string. And so that one single string has this power to occupy more space than it actually occupies. And also just diagrammatically, the way a line represents a kind of infinite length, right? So you can see a segment of a line, but your brain can also read that segment as something that goes on into infinite space, out into the universe, the cosmos, or whatever. And so I started to play around with that in the work a bit, and it was like drawing in space with linear elements like string and thread and wire, and plastic lace, and it was also a way of like creating a kind of electrical current that would pass through the work, and be a part of this transmission that I was talking about earlier. This energy that the sculpture puts out transmits into the space around it, and that you as the viewer become the recipient, and then also you as the viewer transmit back. So this piece is called Transmissions of the Threadbare. So it's like a pun in words with thread and yarn. And also in this, one thing I didn't mention is that I was repurposing a lot of older pieces. So this giant chicken bone here was actually from a series that I made in 1997. So with this new way of working, I was able to bring in older works, including some of the older beeswax pieces, and kind of give them this new life and new meaning by incorporating them in new ways with other creations. This is a detail of the back of the piece with a dried slice of blood orange. This piece is called God's Eye, as in Godzilla with a Z. And it also was done in this improvisational manner. I just started to wind these pieces of yarn and plastic lace around a form. And then I was suddenly like, oh, wait, I'm making a giant God's eye. Like what? So I kind of went with it and decided, okay, I have to make this giant God's eye now. And it also ends up having this kind of form that is reminiscent of a microphone, like a giant microphone transmitting again. This piece is called Once Upon a Time, The End. And I should mention here how I was always very fascinated and taken by art made by children. And my kid would come to my studio, and while I was sitting tortured in front of a bunch of unfinished pieces, just sitting and staring, which is what I do most of the time in my studio. I just sit and stare. While I'd be doing that, he would be off in the corner, just grabbing every material he could get his hands on, gluing things together, and would have like a little thing made in like 5 minutes. And so I found that very inspiring, and I started, and I think it did influence a lot of this work that I was, this new direction of working in this more improvisational way. So like, for example, this piece was top heavy, so it kept toppling over, so I had these rocks in my studio that I had been experimenting with to use as materials, and I just grabbed one of them and put it on the piece, and it allowed the piece to stand, which is, if any of you are sculptors, that's one of the most exciting things about being a sculptor, is engineering that moment where you can get something to stand, without falling over. So the rock then, of course, got glued onto the work using paper mache. So it became a permanent part of the work. So this was like something that was repeated a lot. Like in this piece is called Oracle in Reverse. This piece also had a problem where this center form with all the threads coming off of it kept collapsing over. And so just to stabilize it, I thought what would be just a temporary stabilization of hanging some screws off of it with tape and thread ended up being a permanent part of the piece. And so the piece kind of evolves out of its own need to have support to get it to stand. This one is called The Collector, and it's a pretty large piece. They started these pieces are almost like constructions, and they're made of different elements that come apart, so this whole piece actually comes apart, like it comes, like the thing that's holding it up are the 2 milk crates with all the plaster, and so this part, the rod in the center, comes out of the milk crates, so it's like a separate element. So I started to have to make more and more complicated construction so that I could get things in and out of my studio without having to tear the walls down. So this piece is has this kind of aggressive energy, that's created by the pitchfork. And I imagined it to be a kind of almost like a jellyfish or something was just accumulating all this debris that's sticking to it, that it's absorbing as it passes through space. This one here is about 15 feet tall, and it's called Cryptanalysis of the Enigma, a reference to Alan Turing, who was this mathematician. Also has this like transmitter kind of feel to it. So now we're at 2013. This work is called Self-Reflexive Narcissistic Supernova. And this also consists of a recycled or repurposed older work. The object on the right here is a giant mushroom. It's like a beeswax mushroom that's about 5 feet diameter. That was made in 2002, around that time. And I turned it on its side and I collaged a lot of stuff on the back of it. And then I attached dozens of threads and yarns from one point on the back of the mushroom and attached them to this large amoeba shape here in the front. So they were like, so it was like a fragment that I was working on that then I kind of married with another work. And then that relationship that was established between them turned everything into a new work. And then from the threads, I hung mushrooms, store-bought mushrooms that were then dried out while they were hanging on the threads. So this is the other side of the piece where you can see the gills of the mushroom. And the piece is kind of, the idea behind it is that the mushroom is projecting images of itself out into space. And here, that's what that looks like in the profile view. At the time that I was making this work, I just happened to be rewatching all the early Star Trek episodes, and I came across an episode called The Immunity Syndrome from 1968, which features an 11-foot long single-cell organism, an amoeba in space that eats everything in its path, and the starship has to battle the amoeba in space. And there was a certain kind of like crossover in the absurdity of that with this work here. So that was just a side note on that piece. Star Trek has always been a huge part of my life. Well, early on, not so much anymore, but this piece is called Powers of Tenuous. This is from 2014, and the title is inspired by Powers of 10, which some of you maybe know is the famous film made by Ray and Charles Eames that deals with scale. And scale is one of my favorite preoccupations. The idea of like going from micro universe inside of your hand out, with a camera eye into the cosmos and then back again is what is the theme of that film. And this piece, this floating cube is a 10 square by 10 square by 10 square form. And in the center, all the yarns meet at a center point, and then are reflected throughout with the pieces of mylar. So there's something very satisfying about like referencing cosmological topics with like the humblest of materials, like the most low tech of materials that fascinated me, that how you could create a kind of diagram that your mind would be able to absorb as being bigger than it actually is, like conceptually bigger. This piece is called Porous. And I in this work, I had been collecting all of the dried, discarded bread that was accumulating in my household, which was upsetting me so much that we were being so wasteful, so I decided to bring the waste to my studio, and maybe it would, turn it into a material. And so I dried, so after the bread dries, it becomes very hard and rock-like. And then I would paint it or kind of seal it with this vinyl paint called Flash. And it held up very well. And I was kind of amazed how well bread held up. Like I started researching that and came across, like the British Museum has a loaf of bread from ancient Egypt that's like 3,000 years old. And recently, they found crumbs in a site in Jordan that was left behind by hunter-gatherers. So even before agriculture was established in communities, they were already making bread. We now know that. So the crumb was like 14,000 years old, you know, so that was like, this is the kind of evidence that I would present to my gallerist, who of course was not terribly happy about featuring these kinds of materials in his in the gallery, and was always concerned, like, well, Michelle, like, how long is this piece going to last? You know, it's like, oh, 14,000 years, you know. So porous is also a play on this idea of like the sections of space being porous with holes in the space, and the polyurethane foam is this kind of porous material, and the bread is having pores, and you know, so everything was kind of like playing word game back and forth. I was also increasingly using the yarn in this kind of crazy fake weaving way, you know, where I had no idea how to weave or macrame, but I used the yarn to kind of fill up the space and to give tension between the rods and wires. And so it was increasingly more and more drawn to the softness of that yarn, as you will soon see with some of the things that will be coming up here. This is just a close-up of this bread piece, which, you know, this is from 2014. This piece is still intact. I just showed it recently and it's held up really well. So I'm highly recommending bread as a material to all of you. So maybe that's not such a good idea. So I really went with the bread thing. I also like the way the bread kind of harkened back to my early use of bread in the 90s, you know, so it was like all these themes were kind of coming back, like the mushrooms that I did in the 90s and early 2000 were returning as a theme, you know, so it was a way to like kind of explore my own history in a sense, like to have things like circle back in time in that way. Yeast is a fungus, and so my early fascination with mold and the fungal kingdom was kind of also related to bread, which you know, like the whole history of bread is a way to kind of examine our culture, you know, starting from like hunter-gatherers to the customer in the supermarket. And the yeast being a fungus has like it has a DNA, so it has like genetic information. So these pieces kind of are almost like little transistor radios. So if the bigger works are like transmitters, big transmitters, these are like the mini transistors. These works here were made from dried loaves that were glued together. And I called the sliced ones drift loaf, and the bigger ones drift loaf totems. So now we are time-wise just this is called Foot of a Grimy. So this is from 2016, and it was another precariously balanced work. This one is called Colony Collapse, and it's a wall work. So just to show you a few things here. Okay, so this is now from 2017, 2018, this body of work. This title of this work of this group together was Dawn of the Looney Tune. The piece in the center, the orange one, is called Dawn of the Looney Tune. So it takes its name from that. And I've always been a kind of artist who thinks like kind of like as a filter, like I kind of absorb everything that's going on in the news, in the culture, in you know, events and horror movies, whatever. And I kind of filter it all in, and all kind of goes into the work in some way or other. Like my misunderstandings of science and cosmology, it's all like filtered in there. So these works were made during that time after the election in 2016. And there's a certain kind of unhinged energy that I was tapping into. A kind of you know, this one is called That's All Folks, which is reference to the cartoon circle at the end of Bugs Bunny cartoons. That's all, folks. There's a hubcap in the center there. And it's a side view. So the mylar kind of, you know, acts as like a narcissistic mirror for the piece to view itself while being viewed. And this one is called Voidsorption. So there's more dried mushrooms in that. And getting to this piece here, so this was kind of the centerpiece. This piece, I wanted, you know, I had this this kind of new disgust for the color orange around this time. And so this piece was kind of like deliberately like trying to exploit that color in a different way, you know, and I incorporated these carrots in the work. I hung the carrots, and then when they were fresh, and then they would dry out and they would shrink into these tiny little petrified organic things. So during the course of the show, I would show up about once a week to do the feeding of the carrots, I called it. So I would come with fresh carrots, and I would leave the old ones behind, the petrified ones, and I would hang new carrots so that the orange of the fresh carrots would reactivate the work. So anytime this piece gets reactivated, fresh carrots have to be hung. So the piece over time theoretically would accumulate more and more of these petrified little carrots. And the carrots, of course, shrink and shrink and shrink, and they become very lightweight. There's also household sponges incorporated in there, as you can see. This one is called Clown Clutter. So again, like this kind of idea of like an unbalanced, unhinged kind of situation where things are just precariously on edge. Seem to be a very specific allusion to our time, you know, what I was filtering from being in our time. And along with those works, I showed a group of these like kind of more experimental pieces that where I took the bread again as the subject, as the object, and I placed the pieces of bread into a tank and let them, and this time instead of drying them out, I let the mold kind of take over and you know, just to kind of see what would happen. And so they became these, and then I would seal the top so that the mold couldn't escape into the environment around it. And they had these titles, like this one is called Degenerate Pet. I refer to it as the pet series. So this one was Degenerate Pets. This one was called New Pets. They were quite disgusting. And possibly the most grotesque thing about them was that despite my carefully sealing each tank with glue and acrylic and glass, despite that, the stuff inside would find a way to come out, which was very unnerving because I realized that mold is almost like this slow moving animal that is like making its way through layers of glue and glass and all this stuff and coming out into the room, and you could smell it. So they were very stinky eventually, they would start to stink. And I ended up having to sadly get rid of all of them except for this one. This is the only one that didn't stink. And I think it's because the mold did eventually die, and so it wasn't trying to get out of the tank anymore. So I do have a kind of love of using these materials that are, rather temporal, or you would think of as temporal. But in fact, the dried mushrooms have lasted for decades in my studio. I've kept them around like since the days of the beeswax. And so I started to develop kind of an attitude about, the use of ephemeral materials as being like kind of something that kind of is also pointing out to maybe, the idea of like making sculpture that lasts forever is not exactly something to do right now when we live on a planet that seems to be falling apart, at least for humans it is, maybe not so much for other things. This piece is called Substantial Stringata, and the saw here is a kind of aggressor, in the way that the pitchfork was a sort of aggressive weapon. So it's kind of playing with that as a found object form that could give this piece a kind of feeling of like it's some kind of warrior. This one here is called Motherboard, and it's got the mushrooms, the dried mushrooms. One thing also that I was interested in with the mushrooms was the mycelium. The mycelium is what exists under the earth, so the mushrooms are the fruiting body, and the mycelium is actually kind of like the brain of the mushroom that's under the earth. You can't see it. It's like a network of very fine hairs. And it's the mycelium that actually facilitates communication between plants under the ground. So we now know that trees, for example, can communicate through their roots by using the mycelium as a kind of facilitator. So I found that to be very interesting, as like the idea of like the mycelium as a kind of internet, so this is called Motherboard. And just a couple of pieces from around the same time. This is called Map of an Organ Donor, and features a lot of these dried mushroom elements. You can see from the back what they look like. And coming up now to 2020, this is a piece called Just Why Do You Think You're a Plant? That title comes from a Philip K. Dick story called Piper in the Woods, where an astronaut who has been working on a distant planet comes back to the base. And since he comes back, he has declared that he is a plant. And so he is sent to the base psychiatrist to discuss with the psychiatrist why he feels that he has now become a plant. so that's a line from the story, just why do you think you're a plant? And I was kind of playing with this, you know, the sort of fantasy of like how human life and plant life and the connections between the two, you know, how we share genetic information with plants, right? So there's this interconnectedness between all the life forms. And so this piece is kind of, you know, it's kind of riffs off of that. It's also an example of like really evolved weaving on my part. Like I started to do more kind of organized weaving with over and under technique with this piece rather than the more kind of improvisational approach. And just some close-ups. And I think I should probably hurry this up because I realize I'm going a little over time. So I'm just gonna go through some of these images. And, you know, playing along with a lot of the same themes that I've been talking about. This is called Orbit of the Haggis and includes some new kinds of mushrooms that I had found in a market, and also lotus root, which has this kind of mandala-like form to it. This one is called Star Zero. And with these more recent works, I feel like I'm kind of delving more and more into, at least for now, into these forms that kind of radiate out more and have like a more kind of palliative energy to them, like more kind of like healing energy. With this body of work, I was spending a lot of time in the country. I actually spent 5 months straight in the country during the worst part of the pandemic, like the lockdown part. And so I had some really interesting experiences, stargazing in this, you know, night sky. And so the works here were very inspired by night sky observations and stars and planets and moon and sun. And that's kind of where I am, where I'm at now. This work is from that same time as well. So there's a kind of sun reference here, obviously, with the yellow. And Ukraine, maybe now we can say, but I don't know, that's like a new color scheme, I guess. And just to show you some close-ups here, this is a pattern that comes from wood grain. And this piece is called I Talk to the Trees. And this one is called 8-Body Chorus. So the same inspirations of this night sky gazing. And there's for scale, so you can see how big that piece is. And I'm just about at the end here, just to show you the mushroom close up. And together, the installation. And this is where I'm at now, the last work in my studio. So, sorry I went a little over. We did start a little late. Okay. I'll stop sharing. Should I stop sharing or do you want to? Want
You
me to
can
keep?
keep an image up if you want.
Okay.
That was wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate your sharing from kind of the beginning, your early works to now in your studio. It's very exciting. If anyone has any questions for Michelle, feel free to type them in the chat. I guess while we're waiting for other questions, I'll go ahead and ask one. I was curious of how long these pieces take. One of the previous images you showed was the scale with a person next to it. How long do these works usually take you?
Well, these latest ones, I'll go back to that piece. These latest ones take quite a long time because they're so big. So it does take me a very long time to string the yarns across, you know, because it's like hundreds and hundreds of pieces of yarn. I would say that I worked on this piece for quite a few months. I don't know exactly. I mean, I guess it was, you know, it was like I often like will start fragments of things. So like, for example, I started the center of this piece, the center part of the weaving with the stripes. I started that in April in New York City when we were in lockdown. So I did it in my apartment because I couldn't go to my studio. And then I brought that to the country with me and eventually attached it to the stuff going on the outside. And so I worked on that all summer and, you know, the 5 months that I was up there. But I didn't actually finish it until the next year. So it was finished just this past summer. When I decided to lift it up off the ground, I added the 2 beeswax elements.
Amazing. Thank you. We did have a question. Do you use a traditional loom for the weaving or is it all done by hand? The latest works are very dense with fiber in comparison to the earlier pieces.
So I don't use a loom. It's all a freehand style. I have, I don't know if you can see these wires in here. It's a plastic coated wire. So what I'll do is I'll stretch the wire within a frame of some kind. So it'll be either like a makeshift frame made out of wood, or sometimes it's a tabletop. Mm-hmm. So if I want to work flat, you know, so I'll stretch the wire by pinning it at its extremities, and then the yarn gets stretched in between the pieces of wire. So there's no loom. And then so I have to start with the lines, right? And then once I get all the lines that are coming out of the center done, then I can start to weave other yarns using an over under kind of technique. So it's a pretty like simple, you know, like I didn't ever learn weaving or anything. I just kind of winged it. And so, I mean, I think that's also maybe why this work doesn't get fully accepted by the fiber community, because it's not really in the tradition so much. It's more coming from sculpture, and it's more like using the weaving as a sculptural technique rather than like as, you know, a proper traditional kind of approach.
Wow, that's incredible. Thank you. Another question. Do you see mycelial connections between your works when you arrange them in a gallery space?
Do I see mycelial connections?
Yes, like the mycelium from the mushrooms, like the maybe like with the threads throughout the different pieces.
Oh yeah. Well, I think, you know, it's all connected for sure. I mean, the kind of symbolism of the form, you know, like the yarn is a network, you know, the wires, they're all networks. The mycelium is, they're all also ways of kind of contracting space and information, right? So if you take a piece of string and you crunch it up into a ball, right? You can have a giant, incredibly long piece of string, and you can crunch that up into a teeny tiny ball, you know? So the idea, I mean, in physics, that idea you can see, you know, in all kinds of theories about space, right, and black holes and time travel and all this stuff, like a way to like compress information. Yeah, so I see it as all related, and I think about all those things, you know, and that's one of the reasons why I use the mushrooms in the work also as like kind of stand-ins for, you know, like kind of alluding to these things that I'm thinking about.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question, have any of the organic pieces have bugs eat them?
So yes, that did happen. So when I started using the yarn, I was using mostly wool, and I did have a horrible thing happen once where I did this one big piece that was all wool yarn, and it was shown somewhere, and there was a moth, I guess a moth infestation in this location. And so the moths began to eat the work, and I didn't notice it for a while, you know, and so then that particular piece got sent to this museum out in the Midwest, the Nerman, and they were showing the work, and then I get a phone call. It's like, Michelle, your piece is covered with moths and they're eating your piece. So that was kind of a nightmare. They had to spray it down with insecticide. It was terrible. So since that happened, I've been using both acrylic and wool together as a kind of deterrent, you know, to keep moths away. So I almost never use exclusively wool. There's usually a combination of some acrylic and some wool. And there's also something about the acrylic that I really like the colors are really acidy, and you can't really get those kinds of poppy colors in the same way with yarn. With wool, the wool always will have this tendency to be kind of warm and beautiful, you know, whereas the acrylic has this like kind of modern, like plasticky feel, which I kind of like. So I kind of like the two together, you know, like the earthy and then the more kind of modern plasticky. The contrast of that is exciting to me.
Awesome, thank you. We'll go ahead and take any last minute questions. And if not, then we'll go ahead and end the lecture for today. Give everyone a minute.
Don't be shy. Is it only 5 people here, or are there?
19.
Oh, 19. Okay, I can only see 5.
And also, if you want to unmute yourself and speak too, feel free. All right. It looks like we don't have any additional questions, so this will conclude our program today. Once again, thank you all for attending this week's Visiting Artist Program lecture with Michelle. We hope you enjoyed today's lecture, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2 weeks. And have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.